Hi, Melvin. Thanks for signing up for this portfolio review. I have your portfolio here, so let's take a look. Okay, I noticed you wanted me to focus on your just kind of like presenting and how you present your projects, and then also your experimental formats and stories with impact. I noticed you are using Adobe Portfolio. That's fine. It does have some limitations, and since you're out of school, um, you're very young. That's totally okay for now. Consider changing it in the future. Adobe Portfolio, like I said, has some limitations when it comes to presenting your work and formatting and stuff like that. And so getting into a tool that has a little bit more robust features will definitely help with that. So I'm going to click on Stories with Impact. I had a quick look before. Some of the things that I think you're doing well is just making sure to include text throughout the page. The only problem here that you're running into is when you have a lot of sketches that have text on them already. If I'm scrolling quickly, it's really easy for me to lose this stuff. So I think that's something to think about. Also, potentially knowing how Adobe Portfolio kind of works, you can split these images into two and then have them, rather than just one image, you can split them into two separate images in like Photoshop or something like that. And then you can use the kind of like 2-up grid feature. So these images are slightly smaller and contained, and they don't take up as much space. Having full bleed images like this, depending on the height, it's just like you never get everything in the browser at once, and it can just be a little bit overwhelming to actually stop and take a look at this. Create a compelling interactive story. So this is something I noticed before, where you have your brief of create a compelling interactive story for a children's book about introducing chemotherapy to a child and how to deal with its side effects. And then your outcome is, I created an interactive children's book. I think you need to think about how you would talk about these. Like, the thing that I find to be super helpful is go to your parents or a friend or a teacher and think about how you would talk about this project to them. You wouldn't say, if someone asked you, hey, what is this project about? Tell me about this project. You wouldn't say, well, I was asked to create an interactive. Maybe you kind of would when you're young, but as you get older, you wouldn't open up and say, I was asked to create an interactive story book for illustrated book for children about introducing chemotherapy. And so I did that. You'd want to kind of build a little bit more of a story behind it. So something along the lines of, um, you know, I had the idea of creating an illustrated, I wanted to create a children's book around introducing introducing chemotherapy and having them understand that, so that they weren't surprised, or, they weren't, kind of caught off guard when they saw someone with chemotherapy. I then decided to focus on this part of chemotherapy, or this part of the project, and I wanted to use my illustration style. In terms of outcome here, I think it's kind of straightforward, and I don't know if you'd really need to do that. So potentially combining these two like points of like just having it be overview and having that be the one thing here. I don't know if you really need an outcome. The outcome is kind of like, yeah, the book is here, this is what it looks like, and this is the result. Outcome would potentially get into the place of like, if this was a real thing and it was generating sales, or if you got this into a bunch of different schools or a bunch of different hospitals, whatever it may be, that's when you start to get into this idea of separating out the outcome, because you really want to draw attention to those results, to those numbers and those analytics. Yeah, I like how you started to think about like, okay, how do I explain these images so that when I'm not there, people can understand my thinking a bit. I get that. I think some of this needs a little bit more expanding and, wordsmithing. The nurse is a brief character, appears to reassure its feelings. Potentially you'd want to talk about why you made the nurse look the way she looked, or what about her hair, or, some of these features that you definitely put thought into, right? Like, you're talking about the hairstyle here, talking about how do you integrate it with the head and the clothing. Like, just because you have this stuff on these images is great, but you do want to kind of like echo some of the stuff on the page as well. Stands for our present in the story to support an illustrated family. Like, rather than saying this, I again kind of give more detail about the character and the design and the choices. Storyboard shows the events of Sam. Again, you know, these are like, you have these as one image. Potentially consider chopping these up into their own separate images and then using that grid feature that's in Adobe Portfolio. So you can click into each one. And then when I click this one, I see that one really big. I think it's probably important also, I think for something like this, where you have the final product, you have some great images here. And I don't know if this is a mock or not, it may be, but I'd want to have these up here first. And then potentially share your sketches. But the problem that I'm seeing right now is that you don't have images from the book, including these characters. I think like there's very little of that. And so like, that's the part I want to focus on. Like this page, yes, while it speaks to that idea of creating, and you know, the brief of like creating a book for children about chemotherapy, that's awesome. And you can still include that. But like, if you're going to also present a lot of character design, because it seems like that's like what your interest is, then I'd want to see real layouts of that character design. I didn't click into this. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to turn the sound off. Sound doesn't really matter to me for something like this. Come on, Adobe. Okay, so this is just, and maybe this is like the first thing, you know, because I'm getting a lot more characters here. I'm starting to see more of that stuff. So maybe this is at the top of the page. So I think you can do some reorganization of how you'd want to like talk through this. And again, like when I think about how to do that, or, you know, try to work through to my own projects, I think about what I would say to a friend or a family member and how I'd want to explain to them that process and illustrate it for them without having these images. And then I'll go back in and add the images here. Let's go to another project. I know you want to talk about this experimental formats. I saw this before as well. Few things immediately off the bat before I get too into the details. Images like this, where you have these mocked up, this is great. I'm glad that you have these printed out, but like, this is when you start to get into the fine details of like photo editing and presenting your work. And, you know, the lighting that you have here isn't doing you any favors when it comes to the quality of the paper and some of these like, you know, these turned edges and these imperfections here, these like folds. And so you'd potentially want to go back and in Photoshop and edit those out and clean those up, or potentially consider just finding a good mock that would allow you to present these and focus on the artwork and not so much the kind of shading and detail that's coming from the lighting and the quality of the paper stock that you're using here. Yeah, there's a lot of this going on where it's like starting point. I started this project by coming up with different packaging ideas. Yeah, you wouldn't want to say starting point. Maybe it's changing the label of like, I don't want to say step one, but like concepting, or you'd want to kind of like figure out what phase of the process you'd want to kind of call out. So like concepting and sketching, or, you know, sketching process or something like that, right? Research, like, yeah, exactly. So you have starting point, research and ideation. Maybe that's like the first point, maybe, I don't know. I don't think you need a heading for all of these because they start to sort of like further ideation. You could just kind of continue on from like the previous research and ideation. So you're starting to do this here. Started using patterns and colors that would be associated with each, and also introduce storytelling, the packaging, the forms of poems. So I think this again also needs wordsmithing of like, as a first step in the development progress, I developed in the first step of, maybe this is production. So in the first part of production, I started to develop patterns that can be associated with each with each sin, exploring different shapes to represent the emotions with each sins, as well as different color palettes that I thought might work well together. The thing that I'm seeing a lot, and I'm like actually really, I think it's really cool that you're doing some of these weirder projects, but your focus, to me, without knowing too much about you, is like character design and illustration and thinking about that. And I would love to see more story behind the ideas of the characters or their personalities, or, you know, like kind of these things that I can latch onto as someone that might, you know, coming from someone who isn't necessarily like a creative, that is going to be a nicer connection than some of the more technical creative stuff that we like to get into a bit. And also depends on like what you're going for in terms of job and role and like that objective, but something to think about. Like I almost want to see more personality and more talking about, you know, these characters and how you came up with them and why you did them in the styles you did, rather than a whole lot of focusing on some of the other more technical stuff. And again, like I see you being more into illustration and character design, and the medium in which you apply that skill to, or that work, or that kind of focus to, doesn't really matter. Not necessarily doesn't matter, but like it's awesome that you're exploring all these different ideas. Like, you know, being able to use characters and illustrations in books, being able to use characters and illustrations in something like a product or a physical object like this. I think these are really cool. And yeah, I clicked around the rest of your site, nothing too crazy. And take a stance. When you have, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 projects like this, I think you can do something with your homepage where it's not just these little tiles. You could probably make them a little bit bigger. Probably do like full bleed tiles almost, maybe, or something that is more like one column rather than four columns. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I hope you found this helpful. And again, thank you so much for signing up for this review. If you have any questions, you have my email, and have a great day.